morning and happy Tuesday 10 at 10. I am your host, Richard Charpentier, and today we will be, like every week, answering questions from bakers that were sent to BAKERpedia. And every Tuesday we take a crack at answering your questions. So let's get started. So, our first question is someone asking, what are the best natural or unnatural ways to bleach flour? As you know, flour comes either bleached or unbleached, and there are several different processes that are used to bleach it. So the first one, the mill, when millers mill flour, usually with soft wheat, they use benzoyl peroxide, and it's used as a powder form to basically remove the pigmentations and get your flour basically whiter in color. Because flour is, you have the endosperm, meaning the center of the wheat kernel, and then from there you still have pieces of bran and germ, because it's difficult to remove everything. So in order to bleach it a little more, benzoyl peroxide is added, and it will over time also make it a whiter flour. And so that's one thing that is being used. And again, not knowing where you're located, the regulations do vary from country to country. The other process is used what we call cake flour, and it is chlorinated. They're using a what we call a chlorinator. It's done again at the milling side. The miller will do it, and through the chlorinator, they will use chlorine gas, and they will go for about 1 ounce per every 100 pounds. And there's it's both of those things are regulated. There is a maximum amounts you cannot exceed. So, and in terms of you know defining what's natural and unnatural, it's basically what today is being used in the industry. And as a natural way, I do not know what natural ways to bleach, other than lowering your pH of the flour. But basically, those would be the ways that are being used today in the industry in the US to bleach the flour. And if you look at the European Union, those things, there's no bleaching allowed under the EU. So it's only done in the US. So based on what your question, where you were asking, those are the ways that are being done here currently in the US. Next question. How do you know how much cultured wheat to use per batch for yeast and non-yeast product? It's a very good question. So just to break it, cultured wheat is a way to pre-fermenting wheat, technically creating a level of propionic acid that you will get into a powder form, and you will add it to prevent mold or to lower the overall pH of your bread product. Uh, Usually, the concentration varies from vendor to vendor. Usually on the yeast rays, you will see 0.25, basically a quarter of a percent, maybe up to a percent, and that works. But that's going to play a factor, as you know. And again, it depends on the vendors and the concentration. You have a lot of people doing cultured wheat products for mold preservation and for preservation of bread product, but you have to also try it in your formulation to see that there's no interaction with your yeast, because as you're lowering your pH, your rate of fermentation will vary, and it's important to, I always recommend just try it by yourself, just do a small batch and try to see what happens when I put a quarter of a percent, what happens when I put a percent, and what happens when I put higher, and again, whatever brand you're going after, they'll give you a recommended level. So, and then if you're going into sweet goods, the non-yeast raised product, which is chemically leavened, then you have to also pay attention to your leavening system, because as you're putting acids into it, your sodium bicarbonate will start reacting, and therefore maybe bubbling too early or reacting too early, and therefore changing your shape. I've personally tried it in cupcake products. We were getting really good results, but we were at levels on true percent. We're not talking on baker's percent, and I should have been, give you that precision that it's done on true percent and not based on the flour. So if you look at the cupcake, we're going at about 1.75%, so a really high amount. Because again, not knowing the concentration of acid within the fermented product, it's difficult to know exactly because you're not, what level. So in the case of the cupcakes, and we did it with a fermented wheat product, we were about 1.75 based on the total formulation and not baker's percent. So, and that's something we had to basically play around. It took some trial and error because, as you know, we were getting a little earlier rate of reaction of the acid and the baking soda. Therefore, it was changing a little bit of a shape. So we had to, do some R&D and product development in order to correct it. But I recommend, if you're trying to go with other mean of preservation to bring the overall pH down, that's a good start. But again, there's no magic number. It's all about, doing trial and errors and in your own lab and in your own kitchen, and just to see what works before you take it to the plant, and I hope wish you good luck with your trial and error, but very good question. Now we have another question regarding baking powders. And where somebody's asking, what is the ratio of commercial baking powder with SAP, sodium acid pyrophosphate, and baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, and starch? So most commercial baking powders it's a combination, either a single acid, like in the case of the question with sodium acid pyrophosphate, and baking soda and starch as a carrier. It's always the case. And most people go with dual acting, meaning, slow reacting. Usually it's monocalcium phosphate with a leavening acid, either sodium aluminum phosphate or sodium acid pyrophosphate or other different acids, but usually that's the case. And then your question, what are the sort of the ranges for making a commercial baking powder? And again, those numbers are basic ranges. It's recommended that you trial and error for yourself to see what works, because it's a correct starting point for recommendation. So typically, again, as a range, your soda or your sodium bicarbonate will be about 30% of your total. So we're talking total formula. So 30%. The starch will be between 24 to 28, and the sodium acid pyrophosphate 44%. And please keep in mind that as you're using your cornstarch, it's a specific corn target, a specific moisture content, because your shelf life will be affected if you put that into a bag, because if the moisture is not right, then therefore you're going to get an early reaction with the acid or the sodium bicarbonate, and therefore you get a very short shelf life. So it's very important that your cornstarch is basically a dried cornstarch with a certain specific moisture. So I hope it works for you, but very good question, and thank you for the question. So now moving on to our last question: what are the best preservation system for a fat-based cream? So I'm assuming a fat-based cream, either using a solid shortening or they're using an oil. And usually the fat-based cream working that we've seen in bakeries, it's using a fat, palm, powdered sugar, a flavoring system, maybe a little bit of a water to just loosen it up, and then it's piped in between cookies and put it into cakes. And even something that you see in Oreo cookies, it's a fat-based type of cream, and with other, of course, ingredients added to it. But as a base, you can make a cream base with fat, sugar, a little salt, a little flavor, and that's it. So now we're talking about how do you preserve that. So to start with, it's very important if it's done as a cream base, you're going to interact with a cake portion. So that's what I'm most worried about, because as water activity, there's equilibrium when to fat between the water activity of the cake and the cream and whatever other component, it's going to come to equilibrium, meaning to one. So the moisture will travel around with the products and therefore become to one. So in order to find a preservation system that work best, the first thing you need to do is understand where the water activity of the different components are. But in order to preserve it and finding some acids, now you get a little more of a free range. So if you're doing a lemon type of cream for seasonal, you can use citric acid, because citric is a great acid to lower your overall pH, and then therefore you will get also some nice tart, citrusy notes. So it works. I've done it many times. It's easy to do. If not, you have the usual acids that you can use. You have sorbic acid, potassium sorbate, sodium propionate can be used in combination or can be used by themselves, but it's understanding where the overall acid, the overall water activity of your product in order to properly, formulate and recommend the right acid for your product. But in not knowing the shelf life of your product, I would say, check your AW, your water activity, check your pH, and understand that in correlation to your cake product or to your cookie product, or however you fill the cake, you cover it, and look at the shelf life. And that should be a good starting point for you to prevent any mold problems in the future. All right, so this is a wrap up. So thank you again for listening to Tuesday at 10 at 10. I'm your host, Richard Charpentier, and you have a lovely spring day and happy baking. Thank you, and see you next week.